everyone. I'm Carliss Chatman, and I'm your host of Getting Common. In my day job, I'm an associate professor at Washington and Lee's Law School. The topic of today's episode is a recap of a roundtable that me and my guests presented at Law and Society this year: race, racism, and corporate law. Many believe there isn't a place for discussions of race in business law, and my guests will start the process of illustrating why it is so important to consider race. I'll start by having them introduce themselves further. First, Patience.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a fantastic opportunity to continue what I think is a very important question. My name is Patience Crowder. I'm associate professor at the University of Denver Stern College of Law, where I founded and direct the Community Economic Development Clinic, which is a legal clinic in which I supervise law students providing legal services, pro bono legal services to small businesses and community-based organizations.
All right, thank you for joining me. Our next guest is Renee.
Thank you. Really glad to be here. My name is Renee Hatcher. I use she, her pronouns. I am an assistant professor at UIC School of Law in Chicago, where I founded and direct a clinic called the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. Similar to Patience Clinic, we provide free legal services to grassroots organizations, community-based businesses, and cooperatives here in the city of Chicago.
All right, thank you for joining me. Our next guest is Lanice.
Thanks so much, Carliss. It's great to be here. My name is Lanice Panton, and I'm on the faculty of Columbia Law School. And just like Patience and Renee, I teach a entrepreneurship and community development clinic at Columbia. I was also the founder and director of the clinic, and we represent mostly for-profit businesses in Harlem.
All right, and then we have one more guest who will join us late, Alina Ball, and she is a professor of law at UC Hastings and the director of the Social Enterprise and Economic Empowerment Clinic. Now let's go ahead and get into the discussion. And I'd like to start with you, Patience, to get into some of the history. Why is discussing issues of race important in the context of corporate law and business? And why does it matter that the roots of capitalism are in the slave trade?
All right. So the first part of that question, when I first saw that, I thought, well, why wouldn't it be important to discuss? And so I think the answer to that, the second question and the first question are inherently related. So the way that our country was formed and founded, and the economic system that we currently operate on, assumes that our current economic system assumes that markets are neutral, and that these are naturally occurring events that just require us to follow, the only color that matters is green, the color of the dollar. But when we think about how our country formed and how our market economy formed, and I know, Carliss, you've written a lot about this, it's in connection with our major economic system was built around the slave trade. And so slavery, I think, is unquestionably inherently racist, which is where we get to an inherently racist economic system. We've never challenged that. People have written about it and sort of talked about it, but we are just now getting to the point where we could actually sort of unpack what that looks like. And the 1619 Project did like a phenomenal job of like taking this and making it accessible in terms of like the economy of it, making it accessible to the general public. But when we're talking specifically about corporate law, and hello, Alina, and business law, these are the functions that move these systems. Law is so inherently tied to the way our economy works that we have to recognize that racism that the economy was built on is also present in our current legal system, specifically corporate law and business law.
Now, I think for people who are not professors and people who are even not lawyers, it's weird to hear that when we discuss business, teach business, learn about business, that we kind of pretend that race doesn't exist. And all of you are directing clinics and trying to take law students and help them engage with businesses and trying to help them engage in economic empowerment. How is the lack of that history problematic for the work that you all are doing? And anyone can weigh in or start.
I'll jump in. I'll say that I'm not going to give you a great answer to this question, because I think everyone is figuring that out. And I think that we actually need to surface the history more so we can kind of figure out how to translate that history into the classroom. And just to sort of piggyback on Patience's excellent introduction, I just want to add, to be explicit, that the whole foundation of the way that our financial and economic system works in this country was created based on slavery and enslavers' entrepreneurship, honestly, creating new ways of developing credit, the mortgage industry, even the banking industry and the insurance industry, all those foundational ways that we think about our economic system in this country was born out of the way in which people moved enslaved people back and forth throughout this country. And we are now, I think, getting a sort of a common appreciation for that fact. And I think as we're thinking about teaching it to law students, I think we're trying to grapple with, this is relevant. How do we bring this into the classroom? How do we pull this, 400, 500 years history into the way that we teach entrepreneurship and the way that we teach business law? And I think what we're all trying to say here is that we're educating our students, and part of that education is educating them about the history of what we've inherited as a country. And as we're learning about business law, we have to really go all the way back to the way that these concepts were first created.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on the first question, or I can ask Lenice the follow-up question if no one else would like to weigh in on the first one? All right, Lenice, here's my follow-up question for you.
Okay.
First, why is this history untold? Why do we just skip over the slavery part and jump straight to 1900 when we're teaching business law? Why, or why do you think, I should say, why is this history untold?
I think because we don't see the connections between corporations and slavery and business and finance and slavery. We think that everything started in 1865 and Lincoln freed the slaves, and let's just keep moving, and we've solved all of our problems, and let's start learning about business after the Industrial Revolution, for example. Or we might even just go back to the 50s when M&A started, right? Like, we don't even go back to 1865. We actually start in the 20th century, typically with the Industrial Revolution, and we start to think about this is when our economy and our markets shifted. And that's, I think, the starting point. And I think it's really why that is the case. I just think that's the way the books have been written, and we inherit those books. And I think as we diversify our community, we diversify the faculty, I think people start to look differently at business organizations. And like your casebook, Carliss, I imagine you are going to unearth some of the things that really haven't been spoken about or thought about that deeply. And I think that's one of the reasons why is we've inherited the way that business law and corporate law has been taught, and we've just picked that up and ran with it.
Right. Alina?
Completely agree with all of Lenice's points. And I would also just add that there's just a lot of history. And there's a lot of ground that we would have to cover. At least in my classrooms, a good percentage of my class is not familiar. They're not deep. They don't have a deep background in American history. And so it means that if a professor is going to do this well, they're going to have to give a good grounding. And there's a lot of information to cover. And so it's missing from the books, as Lenice said, and then it's just a lot of information. And then trying to fill in some of those gaps so all of the students are really right there with you. So I don't want to pretend like it's easy work to do. I think for those of us that bring it into the classroom, it is an additional lift of work we're doing to supplement and fill those gaps.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of, I think, both Lenice and Alina, it's not only that the breadth of history that needs to be covered, but also it's the stories that students have already kind of internalized about America, right? It's the stories that are intentionally untold about the founding of this country, about what it means, or just like what is the quintessential American economy and the role of business in that. Like this idea that entrepreneurship is a way in which everyone has equal opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Is a classic narrative that I think a lot of our students come into the classroom with. And so as you're going through the history, it's not just trying to cover it, but it's also trying to invite the students to unlearn some of the narratives that have left out the fact that this country was born on the genocide of Indigenous people and the taking of land, and also on the slavery of Black folks, and the primitive accumulation of our economy comes through those primary two things, right? And so it's like wrestling with that, all the while trying to teach the contemporary concepts of corporations and partnerships and LLCs, I think is really a difficult lift, as Alina was saying.
You know, one thing I found that helps my students to engage when we are working with clients and to understand people who are different from them is narrative. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts that we get from the critical theory movement, is the idea that if we infuse narrative with the law, it adds the depth and texture that it needs and kind of helps the law jump off the page. You know, Lenice, I know you've done some research on some of these historical narratives. What are some of the historical narratives you found that you think are compelling and that may be of use in a classroom, or even just in helping people to understand this history?
Yeah, you guys know this, but I kind of went on a little bit of a binge reading slave narratives this summer. I honestly just found them really compelling, and I couldn't stop, because I think as an adult, I just hadn't really thought about slavery in a deep way. I felt like I had learned about it, and didn't think about. I tried hard, right? The trauma of it, to really not think about it. And somehow this summer, I started to read these narratives. And obviously, I think Frederick Douglass is the one that I'd recommend, Narratives of the Life of a Slave, his first autobiography, and he's got two more. And now I'm going to forget the name. Someone also did a biography of Frederick Douglass recently that I would highly recommend. And when you read the narratives, you can really see the way that slavery was a system, and that system built the economic system in this country. And I think sharing those stories and really hearing firsthand accounts of the way that enslaved people experienced bondage and the trauma really gives us a perspective and understanding about the way that it worked. Because I don't think, when I think about the way that we were taught our history, narrative was probably not that big a part of the story. So I really think if I were going to give recommendations, there's a book, and I wish I had written the author's name down, so I apologize. Maybe we could put it in the notes or something. Carliss, I don't know if that's something we could do, but The Half has, yeah, okay. The Half Has Never Been Told. It really is a very compelling story about the expansion of land in this country, as Renee sort of talked about, the building of this country on the backs of not only enslaved people, but also the genocide of the Indigenous people that were here first. And so this book really brings us, it sort of does a little bit of what 1619 does, but really talks about it from an economic perspective. And then one of the great books I read this summer too was How the Word Is Passed by Clint Smith. And he has a sociological perspective where he visits Monticello, he visits Angola prison in Louisiana, and he also visits Washington, he visits New York City, and then he visits a Confederate cemetery. And in those visits, he speaks to people about the experience that they are experiencing as they tour these places, and as they're thinking about slavery. It was just really fascinating to think about how many people, even visiting Monticello, did not know that Thomas Jefferson, our third president, owned slaves, right? The idea of visiting Monticello and not knowing that, right? To take the steps to prepare a vacation and to take a tour, and then to be surprised that our president owned slaves. So that's one book that I found to be very relatable, very fascinating, as he thinks about the ways that slavery is interwoven in every aspect, in every part of our country, and in different ways. So I highly recommend that text.
Yeah, the half is the half has never been told is Edward Baptist. Does he pronounce his name Baptist or Baptiste? Baptist. And what I think is interesting too about this, about using narrative and the lack of understanding of history, you know, not only is Thomas Jefferson a slave owner, he's like in the top 2% of slave owners. Like he owned more slaves possibly than anyone else in Congress. And you know, one thing that I have discovered in my research is to look at those narratives and think about what the business aspects are that the sociologists aren't talking about. And I think about how law happens because of narrative, right? So with Thomas Jefferson, for example, he owned lots of slaves, but he had lots of debt. And in Virginia, the Virginia Code explicitly states that you cannot free your slaves, the Virginia Code from like 1830 or so. You cannot free your slaves if you have any debt. Right. And so when people say, you know, the founders would have freed the slaves but for, you know, the thing that stops them, the but for, you know, is that they're also horrible with money, right? Is that they are leveraged, they're improperly leveraged, and they're doing all the things that we tell our students they are not supposed to do when they're running an effective business. So it's those kind of business aspects that we just choose not to talk about and that are the undercurrent of the narratives that I find compelling. Patience.
So I was trying to find, yesterday there was a really good documentary shown by this organization called Odyssey Impact, and the name of the documentary was History Can't Be Hidden, Reflections from the Promised Land 101 Years Later. And that was speaking specifically, it's a documentary about the Tulsa race riot in 1921. And so to get to your question, Carliss, and the reason for this discussion, so I think part of why we haven't initially learned about the connections between racism, slavery, and the genocide of indigenous people. It's because there's been a disconnect between the people who are telling the business and corporate law stories and these histories. And there are lots of reasons for that, right? Like we can assume that a lot of these early storytellers of corporate and commercial law were white men who just saw no reason to connect back to these histories and the way that our country evolved our economic system evolved. So it takes having our faces and our voices and people who are inherently related to these stories to unearth these connections for the benefit of our society. And why I wanted to point to this particular documentary is because as many folks I'm sure know or remember, it's 101 years since the 1921 Tulsa race riot. President Biden visited the site. Different people took the opportunity to sort of talk about reparations and looking back towards the role of racism in compressing expansion and economic health of African Americans in this country, right? So if I shortly talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Greenwood district, which was a thriving Black commercial district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, miles and miles of community, Black successful entrepreneurs, businesses, public schools, libraries, a thriving Black community that was destroyed by a white racist mob in 1921. And so folks have, and I'm blanking on the number, the net worth, the economic dollars that were being generated by that community that would have provided wealth accumulation for the African Americans in that community, completely wiped out in a matter of hours and days, and never to be rebuilt or readdressed, right? So sorry, I realized I was moving my hands and that was causing weird things to happen. So insurance companies did not reimburse business owners. Houses did not get rebuilt, at least using insurance. Schools were not rebuilt. Libraries were not rebuilt. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, and to be clear, they weren't rebuilt because of racist policies by banks and insurance companies that would say things like race riots were exclusions from the insurance policy, right? So you have a community that builds itself up because of discrimination in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Blacks supported Black businesses because they couldn't go anywhere else. It's thriving. Then racism forced the creation of the community. Then racism destroyed the community, right? Wiped it away. And then racism kept the community from being rebuilt, right? And this just did not happen in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, unfortunately, is one of many Black communities that were destroyed through white mobs and racist behavior. And that impacted the wealth accumulation of Black Americans in this country significantly. That's one way. There are lots of other systemic ways that Black wealth accumulation has been compressed. But those stories don't get told in connection. And you can't talk about entrepreneurship and the business development and business growth in the absence of how Black entrepreneurs have been persecuted through racist practices and behaviors in this country. And I know it's not, Black entrepreneurs are not the only folks who've experienced racism and systemic discrimination, but that's the example that I wanted to give.
I appreciate that connection because, we talk about the invisible hand, and racism is not an invisible hand, right? Like it is not a free market. It is not an open market. You interject racism and markets don't work for us the way that they work for other people. Alina?
Yeah, I was just gonna insert some of the numbers that patients referenced. So it's estimated between $30 million and $50 million in property loss were sustained during the Tulsa race massacres. And, Patience is absolutely right. There wasn't systematic rebuilding of the community, but many people did come back and did try to rebuild the community. I mean, persevered through all of it. And, they weren't compensated through insurance policies that they held. They weren't compensated, by the local government or, by the perpetrators of the crimes. But they did come back to try to rebuild, only for the community to again be destroyed during urban renewal policies in the 50s and 60s. So there actually was like persistent effort to try to sustain the community even after the race massacre. So it's even worse, right? There's like various interjections of destruction of the community, as an example. And I was just to your point in terms of thinking of narrative, actually one of the ways that I start my business associations class is not with a historical narrative of, Frederick Douglass, although I think that's an amazing idea, but I just tell my own narrative. And, I tell them, I'm the descendants of enslaved Africans in this country. And I am here, literally here in this country, in this classroom, because of corporations, right? That's kind of how I started off. And really what I'm trying to get them to think about is most of them are in this classroom because of a corporation too, right? Like there's very few stories we can tell in this country that are not connected, right? So don't go back to some corporate movement or some corporate activity. So, to me, the story of race and racism are so closely tied because that's just the story of my family. That's the story of me. But what I'm trying to get them to see is that corporations are so powerful in all of our narratives. And if they can take that away, that's a win for me in terms of the class.
Wow, that's really compelling. I never thought about saying that way, because as soon as you mentioned, whose life isn't touched by corporations, I think about Great Migration. I think about company towns. I think, about people who even just came on boats from Europe voluntarily. What is driving them to come here? And it's corporate power. So the idea that we think, my biggest pet peeve is the distinction between public and private law, as if they aren't symbiotic. And as if what we do on the private side doesn't influence the public. The mere presence of human beings, and so many human beings on this continent, is corporate driven. And so the idea that we can just kind of legislate, people without thinking about corporations at all it fascinates me. It truly does. All right, now, Renee, I would love to talk to you a little bit more about how the history of the slave trade and racism impacts our present day work and what you are doing with Black entrepreneurs and businesses. Can you see the echoes of the narratives we've talked about in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's layered in so many different ways, both in terms of like what we see as the structural and the foundational system that our clients are working in. So, new entrepreneurs, businesses, simply the way that that works, and the way that power functions in this country, right? Race is embedded in all of those systems in particular ways that affect a lot of my clients, which I would say the vast majority of our clients are either cooperatives or community organizations that are Black-led, Brown-led, and physically based in communities, those communities here in Chicago. But so I see it in so many different ways. A lot, for example, of the popular discussion is often around this idea of the wealth gap, which is a term that I tend to stray away from, in part because it's simply descriptive and it, in a way, fails to recognize the actual reasons and the way in which we got here, right? Which is founded in this idea of slavery, of primitive accumulation through violence, right? Through settler colonialism and the way in which our economic system was born and evolved. And that informs essentially where we find ourselves today. So when we talk about, for example, the fact that Black entrepreneurs simply don't have the same types of access or opportunities related to capital to get a loan for their business, to go to family and friends, to try to raise the initial funds to actually start the business, right? That is very much based in the way in which this history is played out in our country. But then I also find it in positive ways, right? And so, for example, I think a lot of both the TA assistance related to entrepreneurship, small business development, is from a specific lens that doesn't necessarily take into account the cultural histories of Black folks. And so, for example, a lot of my work has been with cooperatives, which are much more aligned with the kinds of cultures and the kind of governance and societal organizations that we see in African communal societies and indigenous African societies, right? The cultural component. And so we see the echoes of that, or I see a lot of the echoes of that in terms of the ways in which folks are talking about managing their business, talking about owning this, and ultimately the reason why they're actually starting these businesses. I think even the idea that business is simply this idea of maximizing profit, that innovation somehow is just only tied to this idea of just making money, and not necessarily for the betterment of community or simply to provide the things that we need, is one that is just simply also very much like base supremacy kind of culture. So, it's layered both in terms of the structural system, but also I think the ways in which we have come to talk about and think about entrepreneurship, business development, and what that looks like specifically for Black folks in this country.
Lanice?
Yeah, so thank you. I was just reflecting on what Renee just said, but one thing that was compelling to me, you mentioned the wealth gap, and I think Patience also mentioned the wealth gap, and just going back to the thought about thinking about narrative. One other book that I read, and again, I would love to actually think about a reading list around this issue, but I read Booker T. Washington's book Up from Slavery, which I definitely, it was interesting reading it now with like a 2022 lens and like the way we think about respectability politics these days. But the one takeaway that I had was he is someone that straddled both enslavement and then freedom, right? He came of age just as the Civil War was coming to an end. And something that I think I have never reflected on is that slavery just ended. And that was it, right? We talk about reparations, we talk about 40 acres and a mule, but he literally talks about people didn't know what to do, right? When you've controlled people for hundreds of years and you haven't educated them, you haven't taught them the financial system, they don't even know what money is, they don't have money, they can't read, they can't write. And then you say, good luck, and that's it. There's so much power in recognizing that trajectory to get from 1865 to 1921 in Tulsa, right? And to think about how, as a people, to build that out of literally nothing. And that was the narrative that Booker T. Washington talks about, is his experience of emancipation was one day you are enslaved and then the next day you're not, but the resources have not changed at all. So you have people that had one shirt on their back to then 50 years later create Tulsa, right? And so on a personal level, I find that incredibly empowering. And I also think back to what Renee was saying about supporting Black entrepreneurs, we have, as a people, we are incredibly innovative and entrepreneurial. And I think our history clearly reflects that we were able to literally, entrepreneurship is building something out of nothing, right? And so to start with emancipation and to build something like Tulsa, and then to have it knocked down, right? And then now we're here in Harlem, and we're in Chicago, and we're in the Bay Area, and we're seeing the small businesses and entrepreneurs that we are working with in our clinic. And they are not able to make inroads on the entrepreneurial system as it's set up to date. And somehow the way the narrative has been spun is our angel investors, our venture capital investors haven't found, you know, the founder that they could support. It's not a cultural fit, or the idea isn't innovative enough. Again, you know, look back to our history, to how incredibly innovative and resilient and powerful Black entrepreneurs are and have the ability to be. But our current system operates as though, you know, there's this mythical white male founder out of Stanford that's gonna, you know, make everyone the most money. And so I just wanted to share that. I think the story, the narrative, and the proof of where we've come from to where we are now is incredibly empowering. And I think it's important that we talk about that as well.
Absolutely. Renee?
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, Lenny. I think one of the things that you mentioned, which is part of how we have to also start making the connection between not just slavery and anti-Blackness and racism, structural racism in this country. And when we have these conversations about not only entrepreneurship, but like a lot of us who are more broadly in kind of the community economic development space, right? Part of the story that never really gets fleshed out, that is like very much tied to the way in which the law functions, in which society has developed, and the investments from the state, is not simply that people don't have access to capital slavery because of, you know, the lack of intergenerational wealth opportunities for Black folks, but it's also simply the way in which Black folks have consistently been robbed of their inputs or taxes paid to this country, in terms of how those taxes locally get invested to infrastructure, to our neighborhoods that we know have been divested from, you know, and we can trace in terms of federal programs. We can look at local planning and in terms of what Black communities have received or how they have not received, right, the same types of resources, even though we have been paying in, right, the same as other citizens, right? And in white communities who might receive, you know, greater infrastructure and streets and the suburbs, and having us to mortgages to actually go live in suburbs, and having sufficient in our schools, right? So I think that's part of the way in which we have to think about like structural racism, just on a local level, that spatial racism, and the way in which spatial inequality actually affects opportunity related to Black entrepreneurship and to Black small business development.
You know, I feel like we need a book club and a book list and a seminar, because, you know, as y'all are speaking, it makes me think of this book called Banking on Freedom. And it's written by a professor at Mississippi. Her name is, God, I'm blanking on her name, but it's called Banking on Freedom. And, you know, what I find interesting, and, you know, to tie it with what Renee and Lenice are saying about the innovation, it's essentially, it starts with the Freedmen's Bureau, which is allegedly supposed to distribute money to recently enslaved persons, and also to be a bank for these recently, you know, enslaved persons to deposit their money, and how the money is embezzled and stolen and just disappears. So, you know, it's a theft of Black wealth immediately following emancipation. And in response, Black churches, Black co-ops formed their own banks so that people could get loans, often microloans, but also so that they could bank safely. And what's really, really interesting about her book is that it was women's work to run the bank, right? It was the women's auxiliary of the church that would form the co-op and be responsible for the money, because in many Black churches, women are the one doing the service work, right? And so part of the service work was distributing the money, but they also developed norms and standards for how they lent money, that was looking at the morality and looking at their fitness and is this somebody who's out drinking all the time, or is this someone who's responsible? And there, all throughout the South, essentially, there are numerous Black banks that are being run by Black women that are successful, and that are helping to develop these communities that then eventually get subjected to race riots. But it goes to that innovation that Lanice is talking about, like making a way and finding a way to support the community and fund the community, sometimes through donations, sometimes through deposits, and build these things up so that it is possible for there to be a Tulsa massacre. And I think that story of entrepreneurship is more accessible and more compelling than the guy in Silicon Valley, right? Like that is far more interesting and compelling, and shows that it really is possible for anyone and everyone to use entrepreneurship and innovation to build wealth and create wealth and make things, instead of just being a taker. Now, I would like to shift the discussion to something like people say every episode when I talk about corporations and business ends up here. But Alina, I would love for you to talk to us about whether corporate law scholars should be discussing reparations, and what else is it? What contributions business scholars can make in understanding the need for reparations?
Sure. Okay, so to answer the question directly, yes, I think corporate law scholars should be thinking about and really wrestling with with reparations. So absolutely. To try to add put a little bit of meat on those bones, I might digress a bit, but Patience told us about a documentary, The Truth Cannot Be Hidden. I have not seen this, but I love the title because with the clients I work with, the history is so on the surface. So all of my clients, for example, are social enterprises. They are businesses, both for-profit and nonprofit, that are directly trying to impact a social or environmental issue through their business. So it's not like 10% donation. It's like we run this business in a way that is trying to address a social ill. So these are my clients, and overwhelmingly, these clients these companies are also run by individuals of color. That's in part because of the neighborhoods that we have a priority to work within, which are economically marginalized communities, which in our country are also overwhelmingly communities of color. So in looking at these centers of entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and what are the issues that our clients are addressing, so many of these issues have a direct line to both the racist history and the current implementation of racist policies in our country. So that's why I'm like, oh, the history cannot be hidden, right? It is there. It is in plain sight. What so many of our entrepreneurs are currently working on right now is because of both legacy and continued practices of racial inequity. So to the extent that scholars are looking at that, right, looking at different hubs of entrepreneurship and where is innovation that is community driven, what is it focused on? What are its goals? What are these entrepreneurs addressing? It's addressing both the legacy and the continued racist practices. So with that being the fact, then it really causes us to have to say, we need to address this, right? We need to address these root causes, right? So it's not just about allowing the business to get off the ground easier, right? It's about addressing the same issues that these businesses are trying to address at their root causes. And I think reparations has to be part of that conversation. What it will look like, I'm not sure, but I think and by we, I mean business scholars, we're late to the table to really take this up. And I'm excited, one, because of all of your work, and because of the work of others. I know we're not the only ones doing this type of work. But it seems like we're like really starting to talk about this in a way that seems like generative and exciting. And I'm looking forward to like the next decade of scholarship that comes out of both the work that we're doing and the questions that we're asking as business law scholars. Okay, so I hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, patience.
Can I add something to that? Thank you, Alina, for that. I thought that was super well stated. So Audrey McFarland, who's a law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, did a lot of one of her early, well, I won't say early, but this was just several years ago, wrote an article about the way that values are inherently driving economic development and sort of physical development, and more specifically talking about how anti-Black the development process has been historically in this country, and sort of thinking about like why is Black life so devalued? Why did gentrification happen? Why can't Black and brown people be in these communities that are, turned over and all of a sudden, made popular and are places that people want to live, but not with the Black and brown people who've been in that community for so long. And so I'm not doing her work justice, but the point that I want to make in taking that from sort of an economic development, redevelopment context and bringing it into business law and corporate law, is there's some values that our profession needs to acknowledge in terms of how our experience in this country has been consistently devalued by our financial institutions, by our law firms, by our banking interests. Lawyers, corporate lawyers in particular, business law lawyers, get it off easy because they want to say they're just representing their client's interests. But the execution of their client's interests has directly impacted the well-being and health and economic health of African Americans in this country. And until those areas explicitly unpack their role in where we are today, I don't think, I think that's part of the reparations process. It has to be, sometimes we get caught up in the economics of it all, but we have to recognize that dismantling the system really means interrogating how Black life, quality of life, has been devalued by these systems in the first place. And, you see that in the medical field industry where people are paying more attention to the Black experience, but our work and the work of others also needs to take on this task.
Yeah, I think we have a habit, not we, but we as corporate lawyers and economists, of pretending the numbers are neutral, of saying, this land is just worth less through this Black neighborhood, and it would only cost you 10 cents to build this highway here, whereas it'll cost you $10 to build a highway over there. So it's just plain economics that you should dismantle this neighborhood and put the highway through here, without thinking about the complexity behind the numbers. And I think that's intentional. And it's also the reason that we don't talk about why we value that. We don't talk about why the Black neighborhood is 10 cents instead of $10. And I think that's a failure of the economists and the lawyers who are just like, I'm looking at the spreadsheet. But I also think when we are assessing who deserves reparations, how we get reparations, what do reparations look like, we have to think about the fact that the system of racism is embedded in our unconscious thinking across the board, right? That actuaries are not neutral, that economists are not neutral, that everyone is coming up with these neutral numbers, and that the numbers that are not lying, they're telling the truth, but it's telling a truth that deserves the full story and deserves the complexity. Renee, it feels like you're about to say something. No?
No, I was so appreciating the points that both you and Patience just made about structures and processes, right? And how they're inherently racist. Because I think a lot of us, I think we come to this work in different ways, both in terms of our personal experiences and also in just being in the space working with clients. One of the things that I remember I was trying to figure out in law school is like, well, how do you how do you increase the quality of life and make sure that people have access to the needs and the goods and services that they need, but not in a way that is both a tool, like gentrification as a tool of violence, right? And as a tool of dismantling communities and support systems, specifically for, Black community cities, and thinking about that on a larger level. And, as we talk about the reparations conversation, I feel like there's so many different pieces to that conversation, but part of it too, I feel like I'm always eager to talk about, well, how are we also going to address the present situation that we find ourselves in? It's because these systems continue, there are plenty of policies that are still in place that are causing the same type of harm that our communities have suffered for generations. And so I'm always interested in both thinking and getting to the history and like the root of it, but also like, what does that mean for present day and like the systems that we find ourselves that are still in place?
Absolutely. Lenice?
Yeah, no, thank you. I was just thinking about what you guys were just saying, and I wanted to say that I think that business law scholars have a lot to contribute in terms of thinking about how we can work with economists, how we can work with bringing this idea of private law and sort of making that connection between the way that it has served the public and served our system, and just I think bringing that to the surface. I think really surfacing the inequity that business law contributes to. And I just also want to say one thing that my summer exploration revealed, which I didn't realize, is that the federal government currently spends millions of dollars on Confederate monuments, Daughters of the Confederacy. I think $40 to $50 million annually is spent on descendants of the Confederate soldiers. So I just want to say that I think a few years ago, reparations was this like lightning bolt, this hot button topic, and like this impossibility and like no way. And I just want to say, looking at history, looking at facts, and really understanding we are already paying money to certain, to those that perpetuate racist ideology, right? And who were traitors to our country. So this idea that we don't value Black lives and this notion that we need to pay back the people that built this country is a topic that's taboo, and that business law scholars can't discuss it. Well, we have to look at what we are already, how we are voting with our dollars and with our money, and the federal government is already involved in supporting these racist communities.
I think it's also worth noting that when the Civil War ended, there were reparations paid. It was paid to slave owners to compensate them for their property loss. Right now, I'd like to take the last few minutes talking about pedagogy. We are all professors. And this is kind of an open question to everyone. A few years ago, I guess it was maybe 2 years ago, there was a bit of a controversy on one of the business law professor listservs, because people asked, how are you incorporating race? How do you teach race in the classroom? And a lot of white men replied, unsubscribe. And a lot of white men said, we shouldn't be doing that. And so anytime I talk about pedagogy, I would love for y'all to just explain why. Why is it important for us to be talking about race and racism and slavery in our classrooms and to our students? And anyone can jump in on answering the why.
Sure, I can start, because we're preparing our students for practice, which is another way of saying we're preparing our students for reality, and race and racism is part of reality. So in providing this context to our students and allowing them to think critically on these issues, we are better preparing them to understand the various different components of reality. So that's just sort of like a basic why. An additional why, at least for me, that motivates me is because I want my students to get excited and partner with me in trying to dismantle some of this stuff. So I understand that's probably going to be a smaller group of the students that I'm trying that I'm going to be able to reach. But I use the opportunity in the classroom to give them an opportunity to think about, oh, if I can understand how various types of law, but definitely corporate law, continues to subordinate, then I can think about how to use that to also facilitate empowerment.
I love that answer, Alina. And the only thing I wanted to add, which I think a lot of you have already touched upon, is that the traditional pedagogy related to business law is racialized for all the reasons that we've just been talking about, right? So one, I think we have to recognize that just in the way that these systems have both evolved and the way in which they function. And so part of it is just telling the fullness of what that actually is and what that looks like, and then demonstrating the ways in which what currently exists, the actual way in which business law currently functions, continues to produce racist results, right? And reinforce racist structures in our society, right? So I think part of it is that it's not that we're simply trying to reveal a more full truth of what currently exists related to business law.
And I just want to say, I think one way to look at it is that we are examining markets, right? And we're saying that markets can solve our problem, all the problems of our time. Well, we can't do that unless we examine the role that markets and corporations played in creating the challenges that we're trying to solve.
All lawyers are subject to the rules of professional conduct within their state, and the preamble to the rules say that lawyers are responsible for the special quality or the unique quality of justice. And so justice is supposed to run throughout all disciplines of practice, including corporate and business law. And that's why I think it's critically important that we talk to our students about these issues.
And I'll just, end by saying the reason I think it's important is because I like to teach my students reality. And I like to teach my students the law and what is real, not some fairy tale. And I think, if there isn't the time or place to give them a dose of reality and to help them understand what's happening, it's law school. Like it's our last chance to give them accurate histories, to give them accurate narratives, and to give them the accurate tools they need to both be culturally competent as they practice, but also to have an accurate reflection of what the law is and what it says. And, when we say, we only talk about race in con law, or we only talk about race in property, but we don't talk about race in contracts or corporations, it just doesn't give our students a full picture. And so, that's my motivation for doing so. All right, well, that is the end of our hour, which always goes super, super fast. So I would first like to thank all of my guests for appearing. I should say we're doing this again in South Africa, which is exciting, although it'll be virtual in South Africa in December. And I would love to continue, starting a book club, starting seminars, and just providing, other scholars and even just the general public with this information, because I think it is missing from both business law education, regular business education, and just education in general. So I greatly appreciate the work all these women are doing, and I appreciate them joining me on the podcast. Now, if you ever miss an episode of this podcast, you can catch it anywhere podcasts are played. You can also find it on the Voice America website, and we have a YouTube channel, Getting Common. Feel free to send me emails through the show page or reach out to me on social media. I am at Carliss C on all platforms. Thank you again for listening, and thank you so much for my guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.